I've been talking about the nature of Rousseau's social contract, but I haven't yet addressed the question of distributive justice. So what exactly is his model of distributive justice? Let's start with this. The state, he says, is the basis of all rights. In the state of nature, people have no rights, and so all of them arise through the social contract. The state here becomes the basis of all rights. All rights are civil rights. There are no natural rights that the state could possibly violate. Every right is something issued top-down from the state. The state is what converts force into rights and possession into property. So all rights arise through the social contract. Well, that means the right to property itself arises through the contract. And what does that mean? You don't have any natural right to property, as Locke thinks. Therefore, there are no, in principle, restrictions on what the state may do with respect to property. So everything belongs to the state. You might say, well, then what principles am I adopting? What limits am I putting on the power of the state? Well, really nothing, except that the state must act for the common good. It must abide by the general will. Now, that does not mean the will of the people, as expressed in elections and so on. It means the common good, what is truly in the interests of the people. Now, Rousseau thinks the state will assign people private property. He doesn't actually want to get rid of it entirely. Marx will be inspired by Rousseau, thinking, but wait, you said the whole problem was the advent of private property. Let's get rid of it altogether. But Rousseau says, no, I don't think, actually, the best state would get rid of property altogether. But what it would do is put boundaries upon it, and it would make it subject to what he calls the general will. The general will is his term simply for the common good. The general will wills what is in the interests of the society at large. And so, property should be designed to promote the common good. It should be under the control of the general will. Now, this has a couple of important implications. One of them is that any property that you have is in effect granted to you by the state. It may be that you have a right to it now, but your right is subservient to the interests of the state. And so you are assigned property, but it's up to the state to assign it to you. And what the state gives, the state can take away. You don't have any right to property independent of what the state allocates for you. So there's no way to really complain that the allocation of the state is unfair, unless, of course, it is not in accord with the general will and doesn't promote the common good. What does this mean about distributive justice and about the right to property? Here's how Rousseau puts it. Each man alienates, I admit, by the social compact, only such part of his powers, goods, and liberty as it's important for the community to control. But it must also be granted that the sovereign is the sole judge of what's important. The state only has a right to control property to the extent that it serves the common good. But it's entirely up to the state, and specifically to the sovereign, the leader of the state, to decide what is important to the survival of the state, what is important to the common good, and so what property you end up getting. Well, how should the state do this in general? Are there bounds to this besides the common good? After all, we could agree with that without really having a determinate conception of what follows from that. But Rousseau does have an idea of the implications of it. He says, and here, as in a number of different places in Rousseau, the key point is in the footnote. He says, tolerate neither rich men nor beggars. Now, what does that mean? Well, we should allocate property according to the common good, according to the general will, but within certain boundaries. Nobody should fall below a certain level. Nobody should rise above a certain level. We've got to have a lower bound and an upper bound to property. Now, the lower bound, it's very easy to explain the importance of. He says, look, if somebody is a beggar, they are gaining no benefit through the social contract. As a result, not only is it a source of social instability, they have every reason to rebel against this and no reason to go along with it, but there's a deeper reason. If they do not benefit, it is not rational for them to agree to the contract. and that means that government authority with respect to them is illegitimate. So it's not just a social problem if there are beggars, it becomes something that delegitimizes government authority itself. We cannot apply the rule of law to those who fall below a certain level economically because they no longer have any stake in the social contract. It is no longer rational for them to agree to the contract. And so our application of force to them is no longer legitimate. What about the upper bound? There Rousseau says there's a different sort of reason. Somebody who is rich enough to actually manipulate the political process in the state becomes a great danger. If you're rich enough, then you can actually open up a printing press, for example, or take over a newspaper, or today, take over a website, or take over some media organization that is significant in its shaping of public opinion. You can, in short, distort the political mechanisms that we use for determining what the general will is. How do we know what serves the common good of the society at large? Well, in a democracy, we put things to votes. We try to appeal to the will of the people. And under ideal circumstances, the will of the people matches the general will. It actually promotes the common good. But wait a minute. Does it always do that? No. The common good and the will of the people as expressed in elections can diverge radically. Now, why would that happen? Well, suppose you have wealthy people taking over media and distorting things to their own advantage, manipulating people to their disadvantage, but to the advantage of the wealthy. Suppose you have the wealthy hiring lobbyists to lobby legislators. Suppose you have them themselves financing political campaigns of legislators, of presidents, prime ministers, etc. Suppose they start playing a large role in various political parties. The rich can start having a disproportionate effect on the outcomes in that society. The more they control the means of communication, and the more communication there is, the greater the problem becomes. And so Rousseau thinks it's fundamental that we restrict the ability of anyone to become wealthy enough to start distorting the political process in this way. Ideally, there should be no lobbyists. Ideally, media companies should not be controlled by a few wealthy people. And in general, he says, we should be careful about communication. In fact, he says, really, the more communication there is in a society, the greater the power of the media in particular, the greater the danger of the will of the people as expressed in elections coming apart from what is actually serving the common good in that society. So he says, actually, the more communication, the greater the danger to a society. There are shades here of Homer Simpson. What we have here is a problem of communication. Too much communication.